Hey y'all, it's entry number 55 of this off-season series where we discuss a different player's fantasy value each day as a group. We are another day closer to the start of the 2022 NFL season. Each day we'll drop a name, go through some positives and some concerns of their fantasy profile, and then I'll give my personal opinion at the end. Today's discussion will be on Michael Thomas, wide receiver, New Orleans Saints. We'll start with the positives with Michael Thomas's fantasy profile. The best wide receiver in 2019. Michael Thomas was ridiculously dominant in 2019 when he caught 149 passes on 185 targets for 1,725 receiving yards and 9 receiving touchdowns. During the 2019 season, he posted an insane 33.2% target share, the best among wide receivers. Had 20 red zone receptions, the best among wide receivers. Averaged 3.17 yards per pass route, the third best among wide receivers, and averaged 0.69 fantasy points per pass route, the third best among wide receivers according to Player Profiler. He was the WR1 in standard with 225.6 total fantasy points and 14.1 fantasy points per game. Half PPR with 300.1 total fantasy points and 18.8 fantasy points per game, and full PPR formats with 374.6 total fantasy points and 23.4 fantasy points per game during that season, according to Fantasy Pros. He's showcased a ceiling that not many players have, which is very intriguing at his current ADP. The next thing I really like about Michael Thomas's fantasy profile is his career catch rate and the fact that he doesn't drop passes. Michael Thomas has a career catch rate of 77.6% according to Pro Football Reference, which is phenomenal. He also doesn't really drop passes that come his way, with drop rates of 2% in 2018, 3.2% in 2019, and 1.8% in 2020 over the last 3 seasons that he's played. The last thing I really like about Michael Thomas's fantasy profile is his red zone usage. Michael Thomas saw 18 red zone targets in 2016, the most on the Saints, 16 red zone targets in 2017, the second most on the Saints behind Alvin Kamara, 31 red zone targets in 2018, the most on the Saints, 26 red zone targets in 2019, the most on the Saints, and 11 red zone targets in the 7 games that he played in 2020, the fourth most on the Saints behind Kamara, Jared Cook, and Emmanuel Sanders, according to NFL Savant. It's been a good while since we've seen him play, but seeing consistent red zone work makes him more intriguing from a fantasy standpoint. Moving on to some of the concerns with Michael Thomas's fantasy profile. Injuries and the possibility he's not the Michael Thomas of old. Michael Thomas has struggled with injuries the past couple of seasons, most notably the ankle issue that has caused him to miss 26 of his last 33 possible games. His injury history at the NFL level thus far includes a pedal foot sprain in 2016, a grade 3 high ankle sprain in 2020, a hamstring strain in 2020, another continuing grade 3 high ankle sprain in 2020, and a setback in his ankle rehab that caused him to miss the entire 2021 season according to draft charts. After the injury struggles the past few years, there's a very strong chance that he's not quite the same player he was prior to the injury. The next thing that's really concerning about Michael Thomas's fantasy profile is that his quarterback and head coach are different from when he last played. When we last saw Michael Thomas play, his head coach was Sean Payton and his quarterback was Drew Brees. Now, his head coach is the defensive-minded Dennis Allen and his quarterback is Jameis Winston. Even with the same offensive coordinator that they've had since 2009 in Pete Carmichael Jr., enough of the key offensive pieces have changed from the dominant offenses that Thomas was a part of in the past, and that makes you wonder what exactly his upside is now. The last major concern I have with Michael Thomas's fantasy profile is the added competition he has. This past offseason, the New Orleans Saints drafted wide receiver Chris Olave in the first round of the 2022 NFL Draft and picked up Jarvis Landry via free agency. This is shaping up to be the most talented wide receiver room that Michael Thomas has been a part of. The only real competition for this is Michael Thomas's rookie year in 2016, when the Saints also had Brandon Cooks. which means that the Saints may not have to force feed him as much as they did in the past. Some additional thoughts on Michael Thomas's fantasy profile. In 2020, Michael Thomas was the WR103 in standard, with 43.9 total fantasy points and 6.3 fantasy points per game. The WR98 in half PPR formats with 63.9 total fantasy points and 9.1 fantasy points per game, and the WR95 in full PPR formats with 83.9 total fantasy points and 12.0 fantasy points per game in terms of total fantasy points according to Fantasy Pros. Michael Thomas had 90 or more receptions, over 1,130 receiving yards, and over 5 receiving touchdowns in each of his first 4 seasons in the league. In 2018, Michael Thomas finished as the WR8 in standard with 190.5 total fantasy points and 11.9 fantasy points per game, the WR6 in half PPR formats with 253.0 total fantasy points and 15.8 fantasy points per game, and the WR6 in full PPR formats with 315.5 total fantasy points and 19.7 fantasy points per game according to Fantasy Pros. Over the course of offensive coordinator Pete Carmichael's career as an offensive coordinator, his wide receiver room as a whole has generally been utilized slightly less than the league average wide receiver room. Personal opinion: Michael Thomas is currently going off the board as WR31, about pick 80 overall on ESPN, and WR31, about pick 88 overall on Yahoo. The big thing with him obviously comes down to health. If he's good to go at the start of the season, like it looks like he should be right now, he should be a great value, because even if he averages just 75% of his previous career per game averages, that would put him on a 17-game pace of 93 receptions, 1,084 receiving yards, and 6 receiving touchdowns. For reference, that's around the level that Michael Pittman Jr. and Brandon Cooks performed at last year. I really like the idea of taking a shot on Michael Thomas or one of the other wideouts that's been a top fantasy wideout in the past, but are currently dealing with injury or suspension issues, like Chris Godwin and DeAndre Hopkins at their current price. The reason I like taking a shot on one of these guys is because the price isn't high enough to cost you your season if they bust, yet they could potentially be that guy that can give your team the extra gear come playoff time. I really liked drafting Michael Thomas this year, and I think he's in for a good bounce-back season. For each of these entries, we will highlight a charitable cause or organization. In the past, Michael Thomas partnered with RIP Medical Debt to relieve more than $2 million in medical debt for 1,025 New Orleans residents. Here's a link to that organization below. And that's it for today's entry. If you enjoyed this entry, be sure to like and subscribe.